Nobody wanted the Earth file. The IT sat at the bottom of the assignment list like something rotten. And when the randomizer locked it to Lyra's team, the entire lecture hall erupted in laughter. Even Professor Doran, the ancient insectoid scholar who had taught survival ecology at the Galactic Institute for over 3 centuries, allowed himself a dry clicking sound that passed for amusement among the Mirati. Lyra wanted to disappear. She was Solvon, amphibious, blue-skinned, and already struggling to prove she belonged at the most prestigious xenobiology program in the known galaxy. Being handed the joke assignment on the final project did not help. The task was straightforward. Each team of 5 students would receive a catalog planet from the Institute's database. They had to design a theoretical survival scenario and argue whether any known species could endure on that world for 1 standard galactic year. Most teams received interesting worlds: acid oceans, methane storms, crushing gravity, worlds that were hostile but manageable for the right species. That Lyra's team received Earth. Category 7 Death World. The classification alone made other students wince. She gathered her team in a study alcove after class. Garnet was already there, a brook built like a slab of living granite, arms crossed and annoyed. He considered himself the toughest student in the program and resented being placed on what he called the garbage assignment. Asuka arrived next, a finny with delicate wings folded against her narrow back, already pulling up data on her tablet. Drell, a tentacled Morven who rarely spoke, settled into a corner and began reading silently. Ren was the last to arrive. He was Telesai, covered in soft brown fur, with large dark eyes that always seemed to be watching something nobody else could see. Lyra pulled up the Earth file and projected it so the team could see. The numbers were terrible. Earth had an oxygen-rich atmosphere that corroded metal and fed wildfires. Its axial tilt created extreme, seasonal temperature swings. The planet was tectonically active, with earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis occurring regularly. Its oceans covered most of the surface and contained predators at every depth. The land biomes range from frozen wastelands to boiling deserts. Radiation from the parent star was barely filtered. The weather patterns were violent and unpredictable, Garnet grunted. He said there was no point studying a world that nothing could survive on. Ren spoke for the first time. He said something did survive on it. He said humans live there. The team stared at him. Lyra asked what he meant. Ren explained calmly that Earth was not just a cataloged death world. It was inhabited. A species called humans had evolved there, and they did not merely survive. They dominated every biome on the planet. Garnet said that was impossible. He said no soft-bodied species could dominate a Category 7 world. Ren shrugged and said the data would show them. Professor Doran appeared in the alcove doorway. He had been listening. His compound eyes glittered as he looked at the projected file, and he asked the team a question. He said most groups try to answer whether something could survive on their assigned world. He suggested Lyra's team ask a different question. Instead of asking what could survive on Earth, they should ask what it would take to survive on any world and whether humans could do it. Lyra did not understand at first. She asked why humans specifically. Doran said that was for them to discover. He left without another word. The team divided the research. Garnet would study heat resistance. Lyra took cold tolerance. Ren took toxin resistance. Asuka took radiation. Drell took atmospheric adaptation. They agreed to meet again in 3 days. Lyra started her research that evening in the Institute's archive. She expected to find very little. Humans were considered a minor species in galactic records. They had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel and had a small number of colony worlds. Most galactic citizens consider them unremarkable. The biology files told a different story. She read about human endurance first. A section on locomotion describes something called persistence hunting. Early humans had chased prey animals across open terrain not by being faster, but by refusing to stop. They ran for hours, sometimes days. They did not need to catch their prey quickly because their prey would eventually collapse from exhaustion while the human kept moving. Lyra read the passage 3 times. Her species could sprint in short bursts underwater, but sustained exertion for days was beyond anything she had encountered in any biological record. She moved to cold tolerance next. Humans had survived an ice age, not with advanced technology, but with animal skins, fire, and collective stubbornness. They had migrated across frozen land bridges, swum in sub-zero oceans, and built shelters from ice itself. There were medical records of humans whose core body temperature had dropped to levels considered fatal for every other warm-blooded species on file, and they had been revived. They woke up and continued living. Lyra closed her tablet and sat in the dark archive for a long time. She had expected the Earth file to be a joke, a throwaway assignment to suffer through and forget. Instead, she had opened a door to something that made her feel small in a way she had never experienced before. Not because humans were frightening, because they were relentless, because somewhere in the galaxy, on one of the most hostile planets ever cataloged, a soft-bodied species with no claws, no armor, no venom, and no natural weapons had simply decided that dying was not acceptable, and the universe had been unable to convince them otherwise. She reopened her tablet and kept reading. 3 days felt like 3 minutes. Lyra arrived at the study alcove early, her tablet loaded with more data than she had ever collected for a single assignment. The others filtered in one by one, and she could tell from their faces that something had changed. Garnet, who had started this project angry about getting the worst assignment, sat down without complaining. Asuka's wings were pressed flat against her back, a finny sign of deep concentration. Drell's tentacles moved in slow, restless patterns. Ren looked the same as always, calm and watching, but there was something sharper in his eyes. Garnet spoke first. He said he had studied human heat tolerance, and he needed to talk about it before he lost his mind. Humans, he explained, had a cooling system that most species would consider disgusting. They leaked fluid through millions of tiny openings in their skin. This fluid evaporated and carried heat away from the body. It was called sweating. The brook in the room, whose species regulated temperature through slow mineral absorption, found this revolting. But the results were undeniable. Humans could function in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. They ran long distances in deserts. They worked in foundries and engine rooms that would cook a brook from the inside out. They had crossed the hottest sand deserts on their planet on foot, carrying their own water, for no reason other than wanting to see what was on the other side. Garnet said he had always believed the brook were the most heat-resistant species in the galaxy. He was no longer sure. Lyra presented her findings on cold next. She had gone deeper than the Ice Age data. Humans had developed entire cultures around frozen environments. They built houses from compressed snow. They hunted massive marine animals through holes in ice sheets. Their bodies could enter a state of near shutdown in extreme cold, slowing their hearts and reducing oxygen consumption, and then restart when warmed. Medical files documented humans who had fallen into frozen lakes and been submerged for over an hour with no heartbeat, only to be revived with full brain function. She paused and told the team that her species, the Salvan, would die in under 4 minutes in water that cold. Humans came back from it. Ren went next. His voice was steady, but the data he presented made Asuka visibly flinch. Humans consumed poisons for recreation, not by accident, deliberately. They drank ethanol, a solvent toxic enough to sterilize medical equipment in social settings. They ate capsaicin, a chemical weapon that triggered extreme pain responses in nerve tissue, and they enjoyed it. They consumed caffeine, a psychoactive stimulant that would cause cardiac arrest in a telesi at a fraction of the dose humans ingested daily. They smoked dried plant matter that deposited tar in their respiratory systems and continued doing it for decades, even when they knew it was killing them. Ren said the most disturbing part was not that humans could tolerate these substances. It was that their bodies adapted to them. Regular exposure increased their resistance. They built tolerance the way other species built armor, layer by layer, through repeated damage. Asuka stood to present her radiation findings. Her wings trembled slightly, which meant she was either frightened or fascinated. Probably both. Humans had survived nuclear detonations, not just at a distance. Some had been within the blast radius of atomic weapons and lived for years afterward. Their species had deliberately detonated over 2,000 nuclear devices on their own planet during a period they called testing. They had built cities near the test sites. People still lived there. Beyond that, humans used targeted radiation to treat disease. They pointed focused beams of ionizing radiation at tumors inside their own bodies, accepting the damage to surrounding tissue as an acceptable cost. They irradiated their food to preserve it. They flew in aircraft at altitudes where cosmic radiation exposure was significantly elevated and considered this routine travel. Asuka said that for a Finny, even brief radiation exposure above background levels caused permanent cellular damage. Humans treated it as a medical tool. Drell was last. The Morven rarely spoke more than a few words, but today he had prepared a detailed comparison. He projected a chart showing atmospheric tolerances for the 12 most resilient species in the galactic database. Humans were not at the top in any single category. They could not breathe underwater like the Salvan. They could not survive in methane like the Grun. They could not tolerate high carbon dioxide concentrations like the Pelori, but they were in the survivable range for every single atmospheric type on the chart. And other species appeared in more than 4 categories. Humans appeared in all 12. They had climbed mountains where oxygen levels dropped to a third of their normal atmosphere. They had dived to ocean depths where pressure would crush most species flat. They had built sealed habitats and survived in hard vacuum. They were not the best at any single atmospheric condition. They were adequate at all of them. Drell said one word: generalists. Then he sat down. The team sat in silence for a long time. Lyra looked at the data projected on the wall and tried to find a weakness. Every axis of lethality they had examined, heat, cold, toxins, radiation, atmosphere, humans had not just survived but pushed through. They were not specialists. They were not optimized for any one environment. They were built to endure everything, imperfectly but relentlessly. Gonnit broke the silence. He said he owed Ren an apology. When Ren had said humans dominated Earth, Gonnit had called it impossible. He was wrong that a voice came from the doorway. Professor Doran had been listening again. He told the team their biological research was impressive. Then he asked if they had examined the psychological axis yet. He said that was where the real answer lived. He left before anyone could respond, and the alcove felt smaller. Ren told them the story on a quiet evening when the station's artificial sky had dimmed to simulate dusk, that he had met a human once. 3 years ago, on a frontier trading post near the edge of mapped space. He had been young and traveling with his family's merchant convoy, and the post was a rough place full of species that did not bother with politeness. Most traders stayed in their own sections, separated by atmosphere preference and gravity tolerance. The human had been sitting alone in the common area, eating something from a sealed container with a metal tool. Ren had noticed her because she was missing her left arm from the elbow down. In its place was a mechanical limb, crude by galactic standards, but functional. The human had been using it to eat as naturally as if she had been born with it. Ren had asked her what happened. The human, a woman named Adiz, had laughed and said she had lost the arm in a cargo press malfunction 2 years earlier. The machine had crushed it beyond repair. She had been conscious for the entire extraction. A medical team had removed what remained, fitted a prosthetic, and she had returned to work within 3 months. Ren had asked if she was angry. Adiz had laughed again and said it made a good story that he told this to his team now in the study alcove, because Professor Doran had told them to study psychology, and Ren believed this story was the key. Lyra did not understand at first. She asked what a lost arm had to do with surviving alien worlds. Ren said it had everything to do with it. The human had not just healed from the injury. She had reframed it. She had turned a traumatic, life-altering event into an anecdote she told strangers in trading posts. She had refused to let it define her. The team began their psychological research, and within hours, the pattern became overwhelming. Lyra found records of humans trapped in collapsed structures. Not for hours, for weeks. They survived by rationing drops of water collected from condensation, by eating insects or leather or paper, and by talking to themselves or to imaginary companions to prevent psychological breakdown. One case study described a human buried under rubble for 18 days who, upon rescue, asked for food and then walked to the medical station under her own power. Gonnit discovered something that disturbed him more than anything in the biological data. Humans climbed mountains that killed them, not mountains that might kill them. Mountains with documented fatality rates of 1 in 4. They knew the odds before they started, and they went anyway. They dove to the bottom of their oceans in fragile vessels that could implode from pressure. They explored cave systems so deep and narrow that rescue teams could not reach them if something went wrong. They jumped from aircraft with fabric canopies as their only protection against falling to their deaths. They did these things for fun. Gonnit said he had always believed bravery was about facing necessary danger. Humans sought out unnecessary danger because they were bored without it. That was not bravery. That was something else entirely, something he did not have a word for in his language. Asuka found research on human psychological resilience under long-term isolation. Humans have been placed in sealed environments for months as experiments. They have been sent to remote research stations in frozen wastelands and left there for entire planetary rotations. They had lived alone on small ocean vessels for hundreds of days. In nearly every case, The humans survived psychologically intact. Damaged sometimes, changed often, but functional. The reason, the research suggested, was that humans could form attachments to almost anything. When isolated from other humans, they bonded with animals, with plants, with tools, even with locations. A human stranded alone would name rocks, talk to the wind, and assign personality traits to weather patterns. They created social connections where none existed because their minds refused to accept loneliness as permanent. Drell, who had been quietly reading the oldest files in the archive, found something none of them had expected. A psychological study from nearly 200 years ago, conducted by a Mirati researcher, had concluded that human psychology contained a trait found in no other documented species. The study called it constructive delusion. Humans, when faced with objectively hopeless situations, did not process the hopelessness accurately. Instead, their minds generated false optimism, irrational confidence, and a genuine belief that survival was possible even when all evidence indicated it was not. And because they believed survival was possible, they continued taking actions to survive, and sometimes those actions worked. The Mirati researcher had written that this was technically a cognitive defect. An accurate assessment of a hopeless situation should produce surrender. Humans did not surrender because their brains lied to them, and the lies kept them alive. Lyra read that passage to the team, and the room went very still. Asuka asked the question they had all been circling. She said that if humans could survive any physical environment and their psychology was built to refuse defeat in any situation, was there any scenario in the Galactic database where a human would simply give up and die? Ren said he had already checked. The answer was no. There were scenarios where humans died, plenty of them. But there were no documented cases where a healthy human in a survival situation simply stopped trying. They fought until their bodies failed. Every single time, Lyra looked at her team. She said Dorn was right. The psychology was the most important axis. The biology made humans durable. The psychology made them unstoppable. Garnet leaned back in his chair and said something none of them disagreed with. He said he was glad humans were friendly. The rumor spread through the Institute like a slow fire that by the end of the first week. Half the students in Professor Doran's survival ecology class had pulled up the human files themselves. By the middle of the second week, students from other departments were asking questions. Lyra noticed alien classmates watching her in the corridors, whispering to each other as she passed. She was no longer the student with the joke assignment. She was the student who had found something uncomfortable and not everyone wanted to hear about it. Garnet was the first to face direct pushback. A Pelori student named Sean cornered him after a lecture. The Pelori were crystalline beings, silicon-based, with bodies harder than most metals. They considered themselves the most durable species in the galaxy, and they had good reason to believe it. A Pelori could survive in hard vacuum for short periods. They could withstand temperatures that would melt steel. Their bodies did not decay, did not age in the way organic species understood aging, and could repair fractures over time by regrowing mineral layers. Sean told Garnet that the human data was exaggerated. He said no organic species could match a Pelori in raw durability. He said Garnet's team was chasing nonsense. Garnet, who 2 weeks ago would have agreed, did not back down. He told Sean something that made the crystalline student go very still. He said the Pelori were harder than humans in every measurable way. But hardness was not the same as survival. A Pelori dropped on a high-gravity world with an acidic atmosphere would crack and dissolve. A pellori in a sub-zero ocean would sink and freeze into the seabed. A human in those same environments would suffer, adapt, build shelter, find food, and complain about the weather while doing it. Sean said that was ridiculous. Garnet said the data was in the archive and invited him to check it. The open seminar happened the following week. Professor Doran scheduled it as a midpoint review, a chance for all teams to share preliminary findings. The lecture hall was full. Lyra noticed faculty members she did not recognize sitting in the upper rows, watching. Each team presented briefly. The Acid Ocean team had found 3 species capable of surviving their assigned world. The Methane Storm team had found one. The Crushing Gravity team had found none, but had interesting data on theoretical bioengineering approaches. The presentations were solid, professional, and predictable. Then Lyra's team took the stage. She kept it simple. She told the room that their team had been assigned Earth, a Category 7 death world. She said their original goal was to determine if any species could survive there. Instead, they had discovered that the species native to Earth could potentially survive anywhere. The room shifted. Lyra felt the change in attention like a physical weight. Garnet presented the biological data in summary form. Heat, cold, toxins, radiation, atmospheric range. He kept his voice flat and let the numbers speak. When he reached the atmospheric comparison chart showing humans in the survivable range for all 12 atmospheric categories, someone in the audience made a sound that Lyra did not recognize, a low, resonant hum from a species she could not identify. Ren presented the psychological data. Constructive delusion, attachment bonding, refusal to surrender. He spoke calmly and did not dramatize the findings. The facts were dramatic enough that a Voran student in the 3rd row stood up without being called on. The Voran were apex predators, pack hunters with armored hides and retractable claws. They prided themselves on being the most dangerous species in known space. The student said that humans were individually weak. He said a single Voran could kill a single human without difficulty. He asked why the team was treating humans as exceptional when they were physically inferior to dozens of catalog species. Ren did not argue. He pulled up a single piece of footage from the human archive. It showed a human running across a desert. The timestamp showed the run had lasted over 30 hours and covered more than 200 kilometers. The human was still moving at the end of the footage, sunburned, dehydrated, bleeding from the feet, and running. Ren asked the Voran student how far he could run without stopping. The student did not answer. After the seminar, Lyra found Professor Doran in his office. She asked him something that had been bothering her since the research began. She asked why the human data in the Galactic Archive was so thin. Humans were clearly extraordinary. Why did the records treat them as unremarkable? Doran was quiet for a long time. His compound eyes shifted through several colors, which Lyra had learned meant he was choosing his words carefully. He told her that the data was thin on purpose. Several senior species in the Galactic Council had reviewed human capability assessments decades ago and quietly recommended that the findings be downplayed. Not hidden, not falsified, just filed in places where casual researchers would not look. The reasoning was simple. If the general galactic population understood what humans were capable of, it would cause panic. Lyra asked if that was ethical. Doran said it was not. He said that was why he had assigned the Earth file to her team. He had been waiting for students willing to follow the data wherever it led, that he told her to go further. He told her to propose a new classification, not Category 7 Death World Species, something that had never existed in the galactic taxonomy before, something that described what humans actually were. Lyra left his office with her hands shaking and her mind racing. The lecture hall had never been this full. Lyra stood behind the podium and looked out at a crowd that had grown far beyond the 30 students in Professor Dorn's class. Faculty from departments she had never visited filled the middle rows. Senior researchers from the Institute's governing board sat near the front, their expressions carefully neutral. In the upper gallery, she spotted uniforms she recognized from news broadcasts. Representatives from the Galactic Council's Science Division. They had come from off-station for this. All of it for a classroom project about humans. Her team stood beside her. Garnet was steady as stone, which was appropriate for a brook. Asuka's wings were folded tight, but her eyes were sharp. Drell had arranged his tentacles in the Morven equivalent of formal posture. Ren stood slightly behind the others, watching the crowd the way he watched everything, quietly and completely. Lyra began. She told the room that her team had been assigned Earth, a Category 7 death world, for their final project in survival ecology. She said their original question was simple. Could any known species survive on Earth for 1 standard year? She said the answer to that question was yes, but the answer had led them to a much larger discovery. She handed the presentation to Garnet. He walked the audience through the biological data with the blunt efficiency of someone who had spent weeks being shocked and had run out of shock. Heat tolerance, cold survival, toxin resistance, radiation exposure, atmospheric adaptability. He presented each axis with comparative data from the 12 most resilient species in the galactic database. For each axis, he showed where humans fell on the scale. Never at the top, never the best, but always within the survivable range. Then he showed the combined chart, the one that had silenced his team weeks ago in the study alcove. Of all cataloged species, humans were the only ones that appeared in the survivable range for every single environmental axis. No other species scored above 4 out of 12. Humans scored 12 out of 12. The hall was very quiet. Ren took over for the psychological section. He spoke about persistence, about constructive delusion, about the human refusal to accept hopeless situations as truly hopeless. He described humans trapped for weeks who continued fighting, humans who lost limbs and returned to dangerous work, humans who climbed lethal mountains for recreation. He presented the data without emotion, and the lack of emotion made it more disturbing. Asuka presented the cross-reference. This was the centerpiece of the thesis. The team had run human survival parameters against every cataloged world in the Institute's database. All 11,407 of them. They had applied conservative estimates, assuming humans had access to only basic hand tools and locally available materials. No advanced technology, no outside support. The result was 0. There were 0 worlds in the database where human survival was theoretically impossible under those conditions. She let that number sit in the silence for a moment before continuing. She said the next closest species, the Pelori, scored 3,212. Humans did not just lead the ranking. They existed in a category so far beyond every other species that the existing classification system could not describe them, that a senior Mirity researcher in the front row raised a limb and challenged the methodology. He said the team had used theoretical models, not observed data. Drell responded. His voice was soft and precise. He explained their control comparisons, their variable isolation, their margin of error calculations. He had prepared for this challenge, and his defense was airtight. The Mirati researcher lowered his limb and said nothing further. Then a voice came from the upper gallery. A council representative, a tall being in formal robes whose species Lyra did not recognize, asked a question that cut through the academic atmosphere like a blade. He asked that if this data was accurate, what prevented humans from expanding into every unclaimed system in the galaxy? The hall went rigid. That was not a scientific question. That was a political one. Lyra answered before she could overthink it. She said nothing prevented it. She said the only reason humans had not already colonized thousands of worlds was that they had not yet realized the full extent of what they were capable of. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Professor Doran rose from his seat. He walked to the front of the hall with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had been waiting centuries for this moment. He told the audience that he had studied humans for over 300 years. He confirmed the team's findings, every data point, every conclusion. Then he went further that he said the galactic community had never formally classified humans, not because of oversight or lack of data, because of fear. The concept of a universal adaptive species, a species capable of surviving on any world, had never existed before. The political implications of acknowledging one were enormous. Senior species had chosen to look away rather than confront what humans represented. He said this team of students had done what generations of senior researchers have been too afraid to do. They followed the data. The applause started slowly. A few hands, a few tentacles, a few limbs striking surfaces in the rhythms of different species. Then it grew until it filled the hall, and Lyra stood at the podium, feeling like the ground beneath her had shifted permanently as the crowd began to move and voices filled the space. She looked up at the back row of the gallery. A figure sat alone, partially hidden in the dim light. A human woman with short dark hair and scars on both hands. She was not applauding. She was watching Lyra with a small, quiet smile, as if she had known the truth all along and was simply glad someone else had finally found it. Lyra found the human waiting outside the lecture hall. She was leaning against the corridor wall with her arms crossed, watching students stream past with the relaxed attention of someone used to observing alien species. Up close, Lyra could see the scars clearly. A thin line ran along the left side of her jaw, and the skin on her right forearm was textured with old burn marks. Her mechanical left hand moved with smooth precision as she pushed off the wall and extended it in greeting. Lyra stared at the hand for a moment, then took it. The grip was firm but careful, calibrated to avoid crushing amphibious fingers. The woman introduced herself as Adiz. She said she was a frontier surveyor. She scouted uninhabited worlds for potential human settlement. She had been doing it for 14 years across dozens of systems, and she had come to Pelura because she heard someone was finally telling the truth about her species. Lyra asked how she had heard about the presentation. Adiz smiled and said humans talked. She said word had reached the nearest human colony within days of the open seminar, and she had been close enough to make the trip. The rest of the team gathered around. Gauntlet towered over Adiz, but the human showed no sign of intimidation. She looked up at him with an easy familiarity that suggested she had spent time around species much larger and more dangerous than a brook. Ren hung back slightly. Adiz noticed him and her smile widened. She said she remembered him. The quiet, fur-covered kid on the trading post who had asked about her arm. She said she was glad the story had been useful. Ren said it had changed the direction of their entire project. Lyra told Adiz that the team's thesis had been accepted by the Institute and forwarded to the Galactic Council's Xenobiology Division. It was already generating debate. Some researchers supported the findings. Others were pushing back, arguing that theoretical survival models did not equal proven capability. A few council members had called the thesis politically dangerous. Adiz nodded as if none of this surprised her. Then she said the team had gotten everything right, but they had missed one thing. Lyra asked what they had missed. Adiz said humans did not survive hostile worlds because they were tough. Toughness helped, but it was not the reason. Humans survived because they fell in love. The team did not understand. Adiz explained. She said every world she had surveyed started as a nightmare. The gravity was wrong. The air was thin or thick or poisonous. The temperature tried to kill her every day. Every new planet was misery for the first weeks. But something always happened. She would notice the way light hit a rock formation at sunset. She would find a strange plant growing in impossible soil. She would hear the sound wind made through an alien canyon. It would remind her of something she could not name. And slowly, without meaning to, she would start caring about the place. Not tolerating it, caring about it. The planet would stop being an assignment and start being somewhere she belonged. She said that was the human secret. Not endurance, not stubbornness. Attachment. Humans bonded with places the way other species bonded with mates or children. They did not colonize worlds out of ambition or strategy. They colonized them because they walked on a hostile ground and their hearts decided it was home. And once a human decided something was home, they would die before they abandoned it. Garnet asked her what the worst world she had ever surveyed was. Adiz laughed. It was the same warm laugh Ren remembered from the trading post. She said every world was the worst world when she first arrived, and every world was home by the time she left. Asuka asked quietly if that was why humans were not afraid of death worlds. Adiz said humans were afraid of them. Every time. Fear was not the problem. Fear was the compass. It told them there was somewhere that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the thesis rippled outward. Academic journals published responses. Political commentators debated the implications. The Galactic Council formally acknowledged the paper and opened a review process for the proposed new classification category. Professor Doran submitted a recommendation to create a designation that had never existed in the galactic taxonomy. Universal Adaptive, Class 1. Humans were the first and only species nominated. The review would take years. Politics moved slowly when the stakes were this high. But the data was in the open now, and it could not be hidden again. Lyra received messages from researchers across a dozen systems, some supportive, some hostile, all fascinated. She answered everyone. She had started this project embarrassed about getting the worst assignment in class. She was finishing it with her name attached to the most controversial xenobiology paper in a generation, but on the last evening before the semester ended. She sat alone in her dormitory and looked out the window at the stars scattered across the void beyond Pelura's outer shell. 11,407 worlds in the database. Frozen worlds, burning worlds, crushing worlds, poisonous worlds, worlds that killed everything that tried to live on them. And somewhere out there, a species that would walk onto any one of those worlds, struggle, suffer, bleed, and then look at a sunset through an alien sky and call it beautiful. She opened her tablet and began writing a letter to the human embassy. She wanted to request permission to join a frontier survey team. She wanted to see what a D saw. She wanted to understand how a species could look at a universe designed to destroy them and love it anyway. The galaxy had always assumed the universe was too hostile for any one species to claim. It had never considered that one species might simply refuse to agree.